Today's episode of the Time for Impact podcast is proudly sponsored by Investing in Volunteers, the UK's quality standard for good practice in volunteer management. Check out more of their information updated regular on their LinkedIn page, and stay tuned to hear more about how IIV helps organisations create great volunteer experiences later in the show. This episode is sponsored by Volunteero, the volunteering management platform that helps you spend less time lost in spreadsheets and drowning in emails and more time developing your volunteering program and delivering impact. Whether you're coordinating 20 volunteers or 20,000 volunteers, Volunteero makes it simple to onboard, train, deploy, communicate, and report all in one easy-to-use platform. Hi listeners, thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Time for Impact podcast. Just a quick note from me to let you know that we recorded this episode in December 2025. So you may occasionally hear references to things we're doing next year. Just to be clear, in that context, we were talking about 2026. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, everybody, to this edition of the Time for Impact podcast with myself, Chris Wade. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Matt Cobble. How are you, Matt?
Hi, Chris. I am good, thank you.
Looking forward to another conversation. As regular listeners will know, that we try to bring a guest into every episode who is driving the sector forward with some innovative thinking, some visionary thinking, doing something that nobody else has thought of that we're aware of, or at least trying to push the boundaries such that we can learn ourselves in our own day jobs and apply some of that thinking to modernise volunteering wherever we are. We try to bring you a mixture of names and organisations that you may never have heard of, but are doing really cracking things, and big names of people, big organisations and big thinkers in the sector who you may well have heard of and who are maybe more household names to the sector, certainly here in the UK. And I think it's fair to say that today's guest is probably, well, definitely in the latter camp. A lot of our UK listeners will know who he is. So our guest today is Matt Hyde, Chief Exec of the Lloyds Bank Foundation in England and Wales. Matt and I have known each other some time. In fact, I think, Matt, we met, I don't know if you'll remember this, but we met for the day of your interview for the National Union of Students. I was there for a meeting in the building and you were sitting in reception.
Well, I should probably say I do remember that, but I'm afraid I don't, Chris. That's a very long time ago.
Yeah, well, I think your mind was probably on other things, quite frankly, on that morning. You was probably thinking, I wish this guy would stop talking to me. But anyway, yeah, we did. And then latterly we worked very closely together on the board of NCVO. And Matt Cobble, you have a link with Matt as well, don't you?
Yeah, Matt and I spent time working together, volunteering and working together at Scouts. So yeah, lots of connections here.
So a familiar face to us, at least. So Matt, why don't you start by, this may take some time, but telling us something about your long history in charity, but specifically around volunteering and civil action.
Matt, thank you so much for inviting me on to speak to you today. It's a nice thing to do in the run-up to Christmas. Look, my whole career and life has been spent focused on civil society, and that kind of is grounded in an upbringing above a small business in the Fens, where the whole ethos of that business and my family was about how to make a contribution to the community around you. So I grew up in a small Fenland town called Ramsey, and mum and dad, like their parents and their parents before them, were very connected to the church, but also in all aspects of civic life, whether it be the Rotary Club or the Women's Institute or the Scouts. But also, it seems like a sort of bygone age, but fates and coming together as a community. Dad for years organised the switch on of the Christmas lights as part of the Chamber of Trade. He was the chair of the school governors as well. And so that was that was the normed behaviour. And all of us, my two brothers and sister, have all gone on to do something in public service. And mum and dad are thankfully still with us in their mid-80s and are still volunteering at least 2 or 3 nights a week. In fact, I was with them just last weekend, and Dad had been Father Christmas on the Rotary float, and that night he was organising something called Tinsel and Brass at the local church. They're dynamos, and I think, as we know with volunteering, I think it kind of has contributed towards their longevity, actually, that the fact that they are so deeply ingrained in the community. So that kind of led me on a path that, yes, inevitably, I was a young person in Scouts and volunteered in the very first Comic Relief, where doing a sponsored leapfrog down the main street, where I'm now vice chair on the board of Comic Relief. So these things do go full circle. I was the first person in the family to go to university, inevitably got involved in the community life of student unions and clubs and societies, particularly the football club. Became the student union president, and then after that, president of the University of London Union. And that took me on a path into the student movement. And again, the sort of spirit of volunteerism, activism, campaigning, helping other people, all of that is hardwired into student life. Became the chief executive of the National Union of Students, where obviously you saw me just before my interview. That probably was an interview for deputy chief exec. I was deputy chief exec for about 3 months and became chief exec. Became the 5th chief exec in as many years. And, that was a great platform. Learned so much. The sort of job you do at the early stage of your career, not necessarily at the last stage of your career. So it's a bit of a roller coaster, basically. But I worked with remarkable then young people like Wes Streeting. I was with Josh McAllister MP last night. I mean, many of the people in the cabinet or who are ministers in this government were student officers who I worked with either directly in NUS or the wider student movement. I did 7 years there, and then I became chief executive of the Scouts, as Matt says, and worked there for 11 years, which was a blast. I mean, just an incredible, largest youth movement in the country, one of the great, not just national institutions, but international brands as well. And then last September became chief executive of the Lloyds Bank Foundation. Lloyds Bank Foundation gets funded by the profits of Lloyds Banking Group. Has worked over 40 years, given out about £1 billion in real terms, 45,000 grants, mainly to smaller local community organisations and charities. And we're about to embark on a new strategy in the next year that maybe we can talk about, which one of the aspects of that is about growing giving of time and money, because there are fewer people volunteering and fewer people giving money than there were 10 years ago. So that's kind of, in a way, it's been a common thread right the way throughout my life of of a commitment to pro-social behaviours, but a commitment to growing pro-social behaviours, because ultimately that's what makes the world go round, is when we connect with and build relationships with other people and demonstrate acts of kindness, and goodness knows we need that.
Yeah, don't we just? Well, we definitely will dive into the new strategy of the Lloyds Bank Foundation. Before we do that, do you want to tell us a bit about some of your work, in particular with the Big Help Out as well?
Yes, so the Big Help Out is a national volunteering campaign. It was inspired by the pandemic, when 12.4 million people volunteered, according to numbers by British Future, of which 4.6 million people volunteered for the first time, and 3.8 million of those said that they wanted to continue volunteering. And it was one of the extraordinary moments. It's easy to think that this was a sort of very long time ago, and yet only 3 or 4 years we were stood on our doorsteps banging our pots and pans for the NHS. We were checking in on each other. We, I think, gave the best version of ourselves, and that feels like a very long time ago, and it's not that far. And that's why I'm kind of optimistic that it's within the muscle memory of the nation that actually we can and do, and there are still millions of neighbours checking in on each other and showing acts of kindness. So myself and Catherine Johnston were inspired by that. Catherine Johnston is the chief executive of the Royal Voluntary Service, who, of course, played a key role in the pandemic itself. And Catherine did a talk, and it was about volunteering. And I picked up the phone to her after and said, this is a moment. We need to be working together on this. And we set up something called Shaping the Future with Volunteering, which now I think is about 35 of the largest volunteer-involved organisations in the country, about what could we learn from each other to sort of play forward the extraordinary acts of volunteering that we'd seen in the pandemic. So we did that. And then along the way, I'd had this idea, mainly because I'd been sat around the board table at Comic Relief, that if you could do something that was about the giving of money, surely you could do a similar thing that was about public engagement and the giving of time. So it started out as an idea about, could you do a telethon? Could you track people giving time on the night? But it got a little bit awkward, and if I've committed to giving volunteering, it's not the same as actually giving volunteering. But we were playing with an idea, and we engaged other people like Brendan Cox at the Together Coalition and others, Jez Hughes, who'd been at Alzheimer's. And so we pitched it as part of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, and I was lucky enough to know Tim Davey at the BBC, and they were really enthusiastic and said, look, we've got a lot of content. So that didn't come off. It's interesting. One of my lessons on change is that any kind of ideas that I thought are really good ideas, there's always a moment when you think, do you know what, this just isn't going to happen. And you're just about to give up, and then something happens. I mean, it's that thing about, was it the darkest time of the night? It's just before the dawn. And so, and we'd worked this idea out with Richard Curtis as well, I should say. So that was really helpful. I mean,
there's some experience in that area.
Yeah, well, exactly. And he put me on to a guy who was a producer called Peter Davey, who was one of the producers for Children Near Comic Relief. And Peter Davey said, well, look, in COVID, we did the big night in, so maybe this should be the big help out. And I stand by the fact that if we'd have given that as a brief to the voluntary sector, it would have been called something like Volunteer Now, or Let's Volunteer Together, or whatever. But actually, what was brilliant about this was it's just the simplicity of the cut through. I think sometimes we just don't get this right in civil society, just the ability to really simply distill something in a way the public go, yeah, I love it. So, one of my lines at the moment is no one is talking about civil society unless you work in civil society. There's no one in a pub or a cafe if you don't work in civil society. The problem in this country is there's not enough civil society. But they do get coming out, helping other people, that sort of thing. We then did the line in state for the Queen, and on the last day I saw Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, who comes to thank some of our volunteers. I said, have you got an idea for the coronation? Do you know what you're going to do on the Bank Holiday Monday? And he said, well, funny enough, I'm just about to go to a meeting. And I said, I think I've got an idea for you. And that led to then us getting the green light to run a day to promote volunteering, which we did on the Bank Holiday Monday of the coronation. 7.2 million took part, 6.5 million people took part the following year. We haven't run it this year, but I'm delighted to say we are going to run it next year from the 5th to the 8th of June alongside the big lunch, and it's going to be organised this year by the Eden Project. So we're delighted with that. We announced the day at a reception 2 weeks ago with the King and the Queen, but also the President of Germany, who was on a state visit, because the President of Germany had been inspired by the Big Help Out, so much so that they're running their own National Day of Volunteering on the 23rd of May next year.
Good.
I'm absolutely thrilled that when you get this idea that it's a really simple idea, just think about volunteering, make it easy, get involved, because we know that the importance is that first step that you take. I learned this particularly in Scouts. That is so exciting, and it's targeted at the 1 in 5 who say they've never even thought about volunteering. Yes, it gives a moment to thank those who are already volunteering, but really it's about how do you get into those markets where people have never thought about volunteering.
It always struck me that sometimes, particularly around the sort of the first big help out, that almost the people who understood this the least seem to be some of us in civil society going, what is this trying to achieve? And I think I've always been a big advocate for the fact, almost that bit you pointed out, which is like, how do we get people talking about volunteering, right? That aren't talking about volunteering. And it felt like that was a key part of this recipe, which is like, actually, the ultimate victory here is more people volunteering, right? But if we can get more people volunteering, there's a route to that, which is we have to get more people talking about it. And it feels to me like that's been almost something that's gone throughout your career in the different places you've been, which is always about looking upwards and outwards, not just looking inwards at what we're doing, but how can we all move together to make this something that that is going to be more successful, and having that conversation is a key part of that.
It's a really astute observation. I talk a lot about my upbringing, probably more in this job than any of the others I've done in a strange way. But, I do worry that some of the language and the way we talk within civil society is about talking to ourselves and not talking to the public. I mean, it's true whether you're in Scouts or a membership organisation or whatever, you're already in it. You've drunk the Kool-Aid. If you want to expand, you've got to be able to use new methods, new ways of talking, new techniques to make it more frictionless, to want to participate and to grow your offer. Because we know already how powerful it is. And I think that was true even back at NUS. You got a lot of people, I mean, predominantly from the left, it has to be said, who, if you want to change policy that's more pro-student, you've got to appeal to people who aren't students. So you've got to, I always have said, I mean, I used to say this to Wes back in the day and others as well, it's always about the middle 60%. You're going to have 20% who are with you, and there'll be 20% of the people you might struggle with, but you've got to appeal to the 60%. And how can you grow that and appeal to as many people within that 60% as possible? So things like doing a rebranding, or what we tried to do when we introduced Squirrel Scouts, so Scouts for 4 and 5-year-olds, was all about trying to open up new audiences and new markets. If that's your aim, and that was always my aim, and the point about the Big Help Out is to say, you can become a bit too purist about volunteering as well. I mean, in my view, anything that nudges pro-social behaviour that brings people together is a good thing. But if you ram it down people's throats, or you talk in a way that is exclusionary, it completely defeats the object. And this really matters at a time of division. You've got to really think about what is it that will move someone's view to make that first step. And that's all about making it as simple as possible. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And the Big Help Out, as I say, that was my big lesson, the genius of it. And when Sarchis did the testing on focus groups, they'd never seen so much positivity about any other social issue campaigns that they'd tested. And I absolutely believe that's about the simplicity of the messaging.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I often hear in the sector people saying, the stats tell us that people don't want to volunteer like they used to. The stats come down. I've heard chief execs across the sector who really think that people just don't want to volunteer. And if I'm honest, I've never really believed that. I've always felt that it's the sector needs to change. If we change, there are plenty of people with the goodwill and even the intention who will give their time to organisations. And I suppose I'm kind of interested. I was listening as you were speaking about your history, your journey into volunteering, about your parents and so on. And I often wonder what's the secret sauce, because so many of our guests come on this podcast have got in some ways similar journeys to you, Matt, but you're not the norm in society. And of course, you've been in the youth movement, both with NUS and with Scouts. How do we build those habits of volunteering in young people? They're not all going to have parents who are that involved in the community, but how do we build that habit? Because if we build it, it feels like it follows through and people keep coming back. And if you get people getting involved in that Big Help Out, hopefully, as you said, a good percentage of those have said they'd like to volunteer again. So how do we build that habit such that they do keep coming back? We can't presumably just keep doing it through one-off events, and not all of us can afford the Sarchi brothers and things like that. But how can we as a sector start to really build that habit of volunteering in people?
Well, I don't think there's any silver bullet here. But I mean, what's the pathway of life that gets people that shapes people's behaviours? So school and education is absolutely one place to start. And I was on the board of Step Up to Serve that set up the I Will movement. And I remember from that two things that really struck me. One was the disparity in access to social action opportunities. I think it was something like 40% of kids from wealthier backgrounds as opposed to 20% from poorer backgrounds getting involved in social actions. The more you can do to hardwire it into the curriculum, and I know everyone wants to get into the inspection framework, but it does matter that, in fact, my son would be absolutely advocating for this, my 17-year-old son, about the importance of citizenship within the curriculum. And this was a big David Blunkett thing back in the day, and I'm a big believer and advocate of that. I also believe that now one of the things we're really interested to do more of next year, as part of the big help out, is to look at, or this year if you're probably listening to it in January, is that we want to really tap into influencers and others who are cutting through in different ways. I would give my right arm to do something with, say, Sidemen or something like that, just to open a completely different audience of people. I'm really taken by things like Rockcore, who incentivise the volunteering by you do 4 hours volunteering, you get to a gig at the end of it. Listening to Stephen Green, the recent gig they did, 47% of people carried on volunteering afterwards. So what are the things that shape behaviours? And we know from behaviour change it happens in transitions in life. So what does it mean in terms of when you start primary school? What does it mean when you go to secondary school? We know actually, Matt, that even in Scouts, you used to get a bit of a drop-off at that point, and that's good. New habits will form, new interests will emerge, whether it be football or things like that. What does it look like in terms of then when you go to university and the role of student unions and the student movement in there, but the expectations that universities can set, that everyone has to do something in terms of pro-social behaviour. And that's even before you get into the X million people involved in further education who consistently, the sort of Cinderella of the education sector, got underinvested in, and particularly on those things that encourage more behaviours to do extracurricular activities and things like that. And then the other kind of great opportunity, I think, remains business. And we're obviously funded by and connected to Lloyds Banking Group. Well, there's 65,000 employees there. And we do employee-supported volunteering and skills-based volunteering. And it's a win-win-win. Everyone benefits from it. The business benefits from it, the individual benefits from it, and the society or the local community organisation benefits from it. So the more you can make sure that's normed across all sectors, including the public sector, civil service, there's a massive, people are getting 3 volunteering days, but how many of them are using it? Not many.
And using them well.
And using them well, absolutely. And I think that, or if you got all of those bits right, you could really turn the dial on the number of people volunteering. But it's about norming it and making it an expectation. So the way businesses should deal with it, absolutely see it as part of an essential part of a people strategy, because it improves productivity, proven to, pro bono economics, pilot light, others have done research on this, whether it be improves your skills, improves your well-being, and it also has a demonstrable uplift in terms of being proud of where you want to work.
We'll definitely come clearly into the employee volunteering element in a moment. But away from the government side, I'm just thinking of the average, well, not the average, just the medium-sized charities, even some of the big charities. I don't know if your sense is the same as mine, is that there's not really, in my sense, there's often not a very coherent marketing strategy around the charity beyond fundraising. Volunteering very rarely features in the marketing strategy of a charity, in my experience. I don't just mean advertising here. I just mean, what is the marketing strategy to bring new people into their organisation to participate, to give their time to volunteer and so on? Do you have a sense? I mean, you meet more chief execs of charities probably than I do over the years. Do you agree, first of all? But how do we turn the dial on that to actually recognise that if we want to change involvement in our organisation, if we want to capitalise on the latent goodwill that's out there, it's not just going to come to us. We need to do something about it, don't we?
Well, I mean, I do mainly agree, but let's just think through why that's the case. So you've got 170,000 charities in England and Wales, and the vast majority of them are small charities run by volunteers. So, and they are hand to mouth. The watering hole is getting smaller. There's less money around. There's more demand. These are tougher organisations to run than they have ever been. And I mean actually organisations of all sizes, actually. I think small, medium and large brand charities. The pressure of running a large brand charity is extraordinary in this day and age. Whether you're getting caught up in culture wars, whether you're kind of having to deal with, manage risks around safety or safeguarding, and so actually in that context, how you get the resource to do what you want to do is the number one imperative, because that is the moment of existentialism. So it's kind of inevitably the case that how you therefore recruit volunteers gets pushed down the radar. The other thing, and actually we're interested in exploring this a bit more as a foundation and where we can make an intervention, the number of organisations that aren't actually prepared or equipped for bringing volunteers in, even though they want to. So they'll say they don't have enough volunteers, but they don't have the bandwidth to think about, well, what are the ways in which you can recruit volunteers and what needs to adapt as a result. And that, if you think about that, in many instances in any organisation, that was probably about deep culture change. Well, culture change is hard, right? And particularly if you've been around for a long time. So I do agree, Chris, but I think it makes sense why that happens, which is just people's bandwidth and headspace to do that. Plus, where you've got legacy, that's often harder to change. So what's one of the most successful volunteering organisations of the last 10, 15, 20 years? Parkrun. And Parkrun didn't have to worry about a whole load of legacy stuff of some rule that was introduced in 1943 that everyone's got to become bizarrely wedded to, and that therefore, when you say we're going to have some technological change, so we can't do that. We've done that like that for the last 50, 60 years. Whilst we should be resolute in our commitment to modernise and change, we should also probably sometimes go easy a bit on ourselves to recognise that these are tough jobs.
Sure. Let's turn the attention to the Lloyds Bank Foundation, because I suppose there is a role in this for funders, isn't there? And I think you hinted at your new strategy coming up. So I'm hoping there's some stuff in your thinking through your new strategy in terms of, you mentioned boosting volunteering as part of that. So what sort of role do funders play?
Well, I think funders can invest in civil society leadership. There's lots of conversations about how do we support and invest in community leaders? And in relation specifically to volunteering, it's how might we support organisations and the recruitment of thinking through and getting additional support as to how you recruit, retain and motivate volunteers and what might need to change as a result. If I just take a step back and say about what we've done and what we're proud of that we're taking with us in the past. So multi-year unrestricted income is key. But the jewel in the crown of what we've done at Lloyds is the capacity building support. So if you want a strategy consultant, a CRM system, fundraising consultant, support with HR or mentoring or coaching, we will invest in that. And on my travels of going all around the country, meeting many organisations we've funded over the years, consistently people say the money was really helpful, but what was really helpful was the additional support we got around capacity building. And in the new year, we'll be sharing some research that demonstrates the multiplier effect you get from that in terms of growth. So it's within that suite of an offer that we see volunteering fitting. What's different about us from other funders is the fact we're a corporate foundation. So what would be possible if we could get 65,000 employees in their patch making a difference? We've got thousands already who are doing that on volunteering, and whether that be mentoring or whether that be trustees or doing charity forums where they come together and provide advice to other people, or coming together in terms of group volunteering as well. That happens, but we think we can go further on that, working in partnership with Lloyds Banking Group, and Lloyds Banking Group is huge.
Yeah.
It's not just Lloyds, it's Halifax, it's Scottish Widows. It's a big beast. But what if you could actually then do that and get to 28 million customers as well? And how might we use technology to leverage more pro-social behaviours as well for a huge operation, biggest retail bank in the country that has a purpose of helping Britain prosper? Now that's systems change. And one of the things I don't think we've really thought through enough yet is what could AI offer in terms of making it easier to give time and volunteer and to find opportunities in a more seamless way. I know there's lots of platforms out there already, but I think we could go even further than we've done before. So that's one of the things that we're keen to explore, of how do you leverage the power of purpose-driven business that looks at not just employees, but the supply chain and ultimately the customer base. That is reach on a scale that is unimaginable almost.
And it feels to me, Matt, that really links back to that notion of, and that sort of parallel importance of capacity building as well, right, alongside money, because it feels like those two things are really key pillars. It draws me back in my mind to some work I did sort of earlier on in my career, where we were, for a charity I used to work for, where we were interested in looking at, like, we gave out grants as well. And one of the things we were interested in is, like, if we give a grant for a new horse, for example, which is riding for the disabled days, is that better than giving a grant for an electric fence, for example, for like infrastructure as part of the setup? Because we were trying to drive more participation and more engagement. And what's going to work on this? And the research came back with sort of more questions, which was, it doesn't really matter if you give them a horse or an electric fence, because the ones who are thriving, whatever they spend it on, they will do well and they will turn it into positive outcomes and positive activity. The ones that are struggling a bit more, it doesn't matter what they spend it on, they will be back to you in a relatively short amount of time for more money, or they will struggle to turn it into something because they don't have the capacity to make the most of that. And I guess that's key when we're thinking about like sustainability, when we're thinking about this kind of hand to mouth situation, when we're thinking about, actually, how do we escape that? How do we grow? How do we involve more people? It feels to me like those two things together are so important. The kind of the money aspect, because we need that, right? Like, but also this capacity building, so we can leverage all the other things that are important, whether that's AI, whether that's putting a business plan in place, whether that's getting a new CRM, whether it's rethinking your volunteer offer. It feels like that kind of stuff is so critical, like both of those sort of parallel things together.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, let's just zoom out for a minute and take a macro picture about what's going on here. So we've got an economy that's stuttering, and that's before an age of AI and the fact we've got an aging population. The aging population in and of itself means that the economic settlement we've got, in my view, is not sustainable with all the same assumptions we've got at the moment. The state will only get so big, and the market clearly has a key role to play in terms of the future, but it will not always do that in a way that is also helping us to narrow the gap of inequality. The bit that's not been leveraged fully, in my view, and people have sort of played about with it with the big society, but in a more cosmetic basis, is about the power of civil society. You cannot, in my view, achieve neighbourhood health unless you're properly getting funding flowing down in different ways in prevention that is supporting community-led organisations. So we have to have a vision of the future that is about how do you ensure that we're fostering greater resilience in civil society. And you're absolutely right, Matt. This kind of hand-to-mouth basis of the fact that we'll fund you for 3 years. Okay, we're going to now change our minds. Okay, well, now we need to look for another funder for the next 3 years as well, is not sustainable because there's not enough money to go around as we've got it at the moment. So we have to think about, as we look at public service reforms, we look at social care, what is the new compact that we have as a country, and what's that look like in terms of the three arms of society in the broadest sense. So one of the things we're interested in about, and this is particularly in the new strategy as well, is how do you unlock capital, and both financial capital and human capital, to ensure we're building more sustainability into the system. And that is about investing in social enterprises and KICs as well as charities. It's about ensuring that we can think more about where you can get more sustainable and resilient models. How do you get genuine systems change whereby you're unlocking investment and funding in a more sustainable way, from whether that be, I know local authorities haven't got any money, but in a way that's the point. What we've seen on places I've seen on my travels, whether it be Manchester or whether it's Wigan, is where you're getting better examples of where the state is an enabler at a local level, is an enabler for more sustainability and sustainable funding into local community-led offers and solutions. So that's kind of absolutely at the heart of what we're trying to do with the new strategy.
And that probably brings us a little bit to the new September government Pride in Place strategy, which is quite an interesting thing, right? Which I've been sort of digesting a bit recently, which seems to present kind of almost volunteering almost in local communities as a kind of lever for social cohesion. It's a lever to unlock some of that stuff. It's a lever to reducing division. It's a lever for trying to increase access to opportunities. It's, and almost the government saying we need to invest in this a bit more. It'd be interesting your thoughts and reflections on that.
Well, I'm a massive advocate of the Pride in Place strategy, and £5 billion invested in about 243 neighbourhoods, I think it is. Each get £20 million over the next 10 years to get radical change in those communities led by communities themselves. And indeed, our new strategy, which is going to be called In a Good Place, is very heavily anchored in place-based systems change. That all sounds a bit jargonistic, but what I mean is neighbourhoods and people coming together as community leaders in a neighbourhood, thinking through what does their community need, and having power and money invested in them to make those decisions, to make change within their local community. And a lot of the work we've done for about 7 years now, particularly with our communities team, is about working at a local systems level. Because when people say there's no money, there often is money, it's just in the wrong places. So one of the things we do is think about how we facilitate conversations between the different actors in a local area to ensure that the money is being unlocked, conversations are happening and partnerships are happening. And sometimes it isn't about money. It's sometimes about how can you leverage efforts in a collaborative way where you are improving people's pride in an area that leads to improved growth, greater sense of identity, greater cohesion, because you're bringing people together who will disagree with each other. I mean, that is an absolute fundamental aspect of a democratic society. This idea that I think sometimes we talk about communities almost as this kind of homogenous dream of everyone sort of, sat around a campfire loving each other. And actually, disagreement is an important part of civic life. How you do that respectfully and how you do that in a way that genuine leads to change is obviously one of the sort of key aspects of a healthy, vibrant, democratic society as well. But I think Pride and Place gives us an answer to the future about a new economic model, a new compact, a new way of doing things that genuinely gives people agency and community.
It's interesting. I wrote an article a week or two back, Matt, because somebody asked me, is volunteering still relevant in the modern day? A very provocative question to ask me. One of the main 2 points that I kind of put in that article is that in a really divisive world, which is kind of where it feels like we're living these days, actually volunteering is one of the few spaces where people who do disagree can come together and through action find a way forward. It feels to me that is one of those healthiest spaces to actually move from arguments to actually doing something to often we're disagreeing on the methodology, but we're not disagreeing on the fact that things need to change. Actually, sometimes volunteering forces us to find those compromises and find a route through our societal problems. And I suppose as you was talking, I was kind of thinking, well, there's something here about infrastructure, which is really, really struggling to survive and to make the gains that we wanted to make. So we had a couple of organisations on here in the last year, I suppose I could come to mind. One, Crisis, came to us and talked about how they were really democratizing the way they're trying to deal with the problem of homelessness. And they were saying that they were much more about being the convener to that solution, bringing in other organizations, bringing individuals, and working with them to enable them to find the solutions rather than crisis finding them from on high. We had Mencap in a very similar space saying, actually, it's not one size fits all. We need to help local people find local solutions that work for them. Of course, infrastructure is hopefully in that space and is in that space as well. But I was wondering, how do we encourage more of the bigger organizations to travel on that journey? Because as you said earlier on, Matt, it's quite difficult to turn around 40, 50, 100, 200 years worth of history and process and then suddenly put yourself in a very different space culturally, from being the answer to everyone's problems to being the facilitator of everyone's solutions. What sort of advice would you give to leaders of those charities who I'm sure intellectually want to go on that journey, but it's much easier for me to say than it is for them to do?
I think there are risks here. So in my starting point is, I agree, Chris, that I've always believed in keeping your eyes on the stars and your feet on the ground. And when you run a big operation, the more touch points you can have at different points of localities, particularly if you're in a national organisation, and the more you can do to get out and see what's happening and speak to people where they're at on their terms, the stronger you are as a leader. And the better your strategy will be. And I don't mean the strategy as in a document. I mean the decisions you make that drive an organisation forward will be more grounded in lived experience and everyday experience. The challenge is, of course, that the pressures on a modern leader of a large operation means that it becomes harder and harder, I think, to be able to keep your feet on the ground and be as connected as you can be. Because you're managing hundreds of millions of pounds in some of those instances turnover, thousands and thousands of staff. The other thing you're having to do is manage risk. And now, I think this is one of the real challenges for these organisations, and has been for some years now. If you've got a highly diffuse model like Scouts, which is 8,000 separate charities, the power of it is that the local Scout group is owned by that community. It's theirs. They fundraise for it. They've got the identity for it. They're the ones that are empowered to create change at a very hyper-local level. That is amazing. The problem is where the risk sits. And does the risk sit with that group, or does it sit at the centre? And therefore, there's a whole series of considerations then that get thrust onto national organisations and how they manage that. How do you retain the elegance and beauty of local ownership in a way that ensures that you've got something that is evolving to the needs of a local community, and balance that against the risks that inevitably come with 500,000 young people and 150,000 volunteers in the case of the Scouts. So what have some large brands done over the last 20, 30 years? Well, they centralised, they had much more standardised approaches, they brought things to the centre. I think some of those organisations are now struggling because they're struggling to adapt to a world that is more complex and atomised, and yet they've brought things to the centre. And there's a risk that when you then sort of cut off lots of those volunteer efforts at a local level, you killed the golden goose in the process. Because when they were fundraising for their local group or their local branch or whatever it is, but now the money's going centrally, well, hang on, why would I bother? So I do think there's a way to navigate through that. And going back to pride in place, that's what I think is really interesting about communities owning their own solutions. I think as ever, what no one's quite worked through yet is what does that mean in terms of risk and accountability.
As a volunteer manager, you're asked to wear many hats. No doubt your inbox is overflowing. You're using tools that don't speak to each other. And quite frankly, more time than you'd like is spent on admin and manual tasks.
Volunteero exists for this exact reason. Volunteero helps volunteer managers bring all aspects of volunteer management into one easy-to-use, flexible system that can be molded to your exact needs. It is so much more than a database that sends out emails. It is an all-encompassing platform that empowers your volunteers to do more.
We hear amazing feedback from their clients that include the likes of the RAF Museum, the Royal Voluntary Service, and Keach Hospice. So if you'd like to learn more, book a demo on their website, volunteero.org, or email them at hello@volunteero.org.
If volunteers power your organisation, here's something you'll want to hear. At Investing in Volunteers, we know great volunteering doesn't happen by accident. It happens when organisations commit to giving volunteers the very best experience, one that's safe, supportive, meaningful and genuinely impactful. That's why more than 1,000 organisations across the UK and Republic of Ireland have chosen Investing in Volunteers, the quality standard for good practice in volunteer management. Whether you're a CEO looking to build a stronger culture or a volunteer manager wanting to boost retention and engagement, working with your designated experienced assessor gives you a clear, practical framework whilst also upskilling your team. And the best bit is not about perfection. It's about learning, improving and showing your volunteers they truly matter. Earlier this year, Prostate Cancer UK achieved their 3rd award and said that going through the assessment has been a valuable and insightful experience, a great opportunity to reflect, learn and grow. So if volunteers are part of your vision, make Investing in Volunteers part of your strategy. Find out more and sign up for your free no obligation quote at investinginvolunteers.co.uk.
It feels like the two sort of pillars of autonomy and accountability are really key here, right? It's like you kind of need both of those things to be sort of truly successful, but they're almost in tension with each other a lot of the time if the right support and the right structures aren't in place to enable both of those things, I suppose.
Well, I think that's right. One of the things we've been very focused on in Comic Relief is how do you shift power to communities. I think that's where a prize lies, is how really large charities can rethink their model to be investing in a local level, which will sometimes be about seeding power and therefore money flowing through in community organisations in order to achieve your goals, rather than thinking your brand has to do it all. It is interesting when you become a funder. I think far more in a systems way than I ever did when I led a brand. I think it's almost impossible to properly think in a systems way when you lead a brand, because there's still an expectation from the board. You're going to go out there and champion X charity, X brand. There's still an expectation when you go to even philanthropists and that you're drawing money in from, that they want to see how they're funding X brand as well. But I think that's the journey I've been on in the last 15 months, is the power of just thinking about who cares who the brand is as long as it's getting the right results. And I can't help but believe that the evolution of real systems leadership is about how leaders of some of those brands are looking at different ways to seed power, manage risk, but seed power in ways that has local ownership. Claire Kennedy, who runs a consultancy called PPL, I think I heard her say there are systems thinkers and operational leaders, and rarely do you get people who can do both. And I think that is the kind of prize of what we should be aiming for in terms of the development of leadership in our sector.
Yeah. Well, it feels like we can't have you hear from the Lloyds Bank Foundation, Matt, and not talk a bit more about employer-supported volunteering as one of the biggest employers in the country and someone who's really leading in that space. We sometimes talk about it on this podcast, and there's quite a number of people in the sector who really buy into the idea of that, but actually struggle to bring it really to fruition in a way that it really capitalizes on the skills of the people that they're working with, and actually manage to match those skills with organizational needs. And sometimes ESV gets kind of a bad rap as painting sheds and digging gardens and stuff, which has a place. But we've often talked about the real art of this is really finding that magic connection between organisation need, bringing in scarce skills, scarce insights and perspectives that the organisation neither has access to or can afford on a very regular basis, and building perhaps ongoing connection and ongoing community with those individuals and those organisations. So it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on what the future is from a Lloyds Bank Foundation perspective.
I mean, the first thing I'd say is I'm glad you said the point about painting sheds has a place, because I think people get a bit sniffy about that sort of thing. But what I'm interested in on things like that is kind of does relate a bit to the big help out, where people would get a bit sniffy about that as well. I'm not interested in one-off opportunities. Yeah. The reality is, what I saw time and time again at Scouts was, how does someone start their volunteering journey? You put them on the parent roster, they sit at the back of the room, and then you say, could you just give us a hand just moving some furniture? Or actually, we're just a bit short of helping out with this game. And that moment is the moment they've kind of shifted a behaviour. They've been asked to do something, they've done it. They might be even a bit grumpy about it. And then what you find is some people at that point think, I quite enjoyed that. And from that, they might come back another week and help a bit more. And then from that, they start to build a habit for life. And Catherine, if she was here from RBS, would talk about the numerous people who became NHS responders because they saw there was an absolute need for the country, then went on and started a journey for life. So we mustn't forget the importance of the first step. So I think that narrative still stands. I think what employers can do is then, I think you have to start with senior commitment from the leadership team who believe this stuff is going to improve the business. It starts from that. And now where you're right, where you get the absolute zinger of employer-supported volunteering power is through skills-based volunteering, and where people are developing their skills as an employee, are able to contribute to a local community organisation who really needs that treasurer, that mentor, that coach, that AI expert, person who is the expert in cybersecurity that you would never be able to afford, but is providing what is effectively free consultancy. And in the process, that charity builds their resilience, becomes stronger as a result, and then says, thank goodness that because of Lloyds Banking Group, I've been able to develop in this way. And then how do you capture those stories and how do you measure it? I think, the really enlightened HR directors not only get that, but see it as a necessity to hardwire, particularly as part of an offer to a younger generation who want to also be able to talk about meaning and purpose in their work life.
That sounds really important, Matt, and it comes back to sort of almost what you were talking about earlier, where you say like business kind of potentially being one of those untapped areas. It feels like that's a quick win if we can help people understand the value and the opportunities that it can unlock for people. I guess to finish up, like what's next? What are you looking forward to in 2026? What's on your mind?
It's going to be another fun-packed year. I mean, this was remarkable. And so we hosted the Civil Society Summit in July with the Prime Minister and a fifth of the Cabinet, and numerous, I think we had 11 ministers and loads of civil servants. I was lucky to obviously be with the King and the Queen and the President of Germany as we announced that the Big Help Out was coming back. In terms of next year, we'll launch our strategy in the spring. We're really excited about that. It's going to be called In a Good Place, and we're focused on 3 areas that we want people to say, I'm in a good place personally. So we're interested in the link between financial resilience and digital inclusion and their personal resilience, that they're in a home that's a good place to live in. So we're particularly interested in preventing homelessness, but also community-led housing solutions with a big focus on not-for-profits, charities, social enterprises who want to do more. And my community is a good place to belong to. So that will be looking at, some of the themes we've been talking about, place-based work, but also how we encourage a greater sense of belonging across divides. And so that's the strategy. We've got great plans to announce about that, more funding and leveraging more funding as well. So that's really exciting. And that links to that last point about I live in a community that's a good place to belong to. It does link to the Big Help Out, which comes back on the 5th to the 8th of June, alongside the Big Lunch, organised by Eden, our absolutely running at pace now to get lots of exciting things announced as part of that weekend. The Friday and the Monday, it comes to the end of Volunteers Week. The Friday and the Monday allows us to do more with business, more with schools, which we're excited about. And I think in terms of meeting the moment of some of the challenges we're facing as a country, instantly 9 out of 10 people who take part in the Big Help Out and the Big Lunch meet someone they've never met before in their community as well. So that's probably just worth registering. We've just been appointed by the National Lottery Community Fund to lead one of two coalitions working on the distribution of their grant holder support fund, which is looking about how we do more capacity building and support people in terms of their own growth and development and resilience, building on a kind of legacy of success there within Lloyds Bank Foundation. We're working with a number of other people as part of that coalition, including NCVO, School of Social Entrepreneurs, and others as well. And then we are going to continue to roll out our work on place and play an active role in demonstrating the thought leadership and new way of thinking, and particularly the power of sitting at the nexus of purpose-driven business, government and civil society, to bring that together to help shape a wider narrative about what a new way of doing things could look like in a way that communities feel more agency, more ownership, and frankly, more kindness to create the sort of society that we know is possible.
Well, that's a lovely note to end it on. If people want to get in touch with the Lloyds Bank Foundation, how should they get in touch?
Then you should go to the website, lloydsbankfoundation.org.uk.
I just want to say a thank you to you for talking to us this morning and spending what is it now, an hour of your precious time with us and with our listeners. It will be truly appreciated. But also, we don't often get I don't think we've ever had the opportunity on this podcast to actually thank funders. But actually, a lot of the things that we're involved in as a sector just would not happen without the support of corporate and other funders. And you do play an incredibly important point. So I think maybe it's a nice opportunity to say thank you, obviously, to the foundation, to the bank itself, and to your staff who volunteer their time right across the UK in community organisations, and a really important part of civil society. And we ought to say thank you and show some appreciation to you all. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Chris. I mean, look, it's the ultimate privilege being a funder. Spending other people's money. I mean, I sort of describe how I go down to the vaults and take the money out and spend it to some good causes, which is not quite true. But you are right. 40 years ago, having just celebrated our 40th anniversary, it was a pretty enlightened idea to say actually some of those profits were going to go to good causes across England and Wales, alongside our other sister organisations in Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Channel Islands. But ours is the easy bit, which is spending the money. But we do take that with a lot of responsibility, because knowing quite how challenging the situation is out there at the moment. But
spending money is easy. Spending money well is a lot more difficult, as we all know.
Exactly.
So thank you for everything you do. Thank you for joining us this morning. And we, I think, all really looking forward to your new strategy. So thanks you, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thank you both.
Well, Chris, lots to think about there. I think we both know Matt, so we both knew that there would be lots of interesting things to think about, to reflect on, to ponder going forwards, and certainly not left disappointed today. I'm really excited by the big help out next year again, actually. I think it's really interesting for me hearing Matt talk about that initiative in his own words, being really clear about what it's trying to do and how that puts volunteering in the public consciousness. I think we've had these moments over the years that often we look back on as going, well, they were key moments around volunteering. People often look back to the sort of 2012 Olympics or the pandemic or whatever. I think that work is so important in sort of volunteering in the public consciousness regularly in a way that helps people develop an experience that starts to form a habit. And I'm sort of minded back to our Stephen Green podcast about this idea of sort of flexing a muscle around this kind of stuff. And it feels like the big help out's a really key pillar in sort of getting that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, we know Matt, and one thing we know for certain is he'll be a driver and continue to be a driver for innovation and for development of the sector and of volunteering. Always has been, always will be. Big Help Out is part of that. Obviously, the more often we do it, the more hopefully it gets into the public consciousness. But Matt will be badgering away behind the scene with politicians, with movers and shakers, not just around the Big Help Out, but around all things community action, to try and drive thinking and innovation in the direction of enabling and empowering communities to make a difference. I think we can always say with confidence that's going to be Matt driving that kind of work, and we saw some of that today. I was pleased to hear about his own new strategy that's coming through, which again very much has community at the heart, which is great, but also recognises the power and I suppose he didn't say this, but I'm putting words in his mouth, sorry, but maybe even the responsibility for corporates to play a part in this space and to recognise that, yes, they can give billions of pounds to charity every year, but actually they also have a workforce of thousands of people, talented people, who equally can play a part, big or small, in helping address the challenges that our society faces through volunteering. I mean, I think we should be grateful for having champions like Matt in our sector who really understand the needs of the causes that we work for, but also has the power, the leverage, and the contacts to get in there and talk to the powers that be and influence them in a productive and well-meaning way. And he doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk in that sense. And we need more Matt Hydes, in my opinion, in the sector.
Totally agree. Well, there we go. Another episode. Thank you very much, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. It's good to talk as always. We do have some interesting guests, and there are many more to follow. So if you've liked this one, please do subscribe, follow, or whatever the mechanism is on your podcast channel. We really like having you listeners with us, and let us know what you think. Get in touch. You can always contact us via our website, and we always like to have comments and feedback and suggestions of guests, of course, is always good. You can give us a rating or like us on those platforms as well. That's always appreciated too. But most of all, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your colleagues and your friends who may be interested. We're really keen to spread the word, and we had some good statistics quite recently at the end of the year, didn't we, Matt, that showed that we're an incredibly fast growing podcast in terms of listenership, which is really encouraging and affirming for us. So we're celebrating that at Time for Impact. So looking forward to the next episode. Speak to you then. Bye.